Subscribe to Cheating Tales Lab. Now let's begin. Scott Cook stared at the manuscript on his desk, the afternoon light filtering through the half-drawn blinds of his cramped home office. 5 years ago, he'd walked away from a corner office at Morrison & Drake, one of Manhattan's most prestigious corporate law firms, to chase a dream his mother-in-law still called childish delusion. The irony wasn't lost on him that Doris Burnett had spent every family gathering since then reminding him of that decision, calculating the cumulative lost income with the precision of an accountant dissecting a failed investment. His phone buzzed. Marguerite's name flashed across the screen with a text that made his jaw tighten. Mom insists on coming 3 hours early tomorrow. She wants to help with Owen's party. I couldn't say no. Scott had learned over 13 years of marriage that couldn't say no meant didn't want to deal with the fallout. Marguerite had been raised in the Burnett household where Doris's word was law, where disagreement was met with calculated coldness that could last for months. He'd watched his wife shrink over the years, the vibrant woman he'd fallen for in law school, becoming someone who checked her mother's mood before making decisions about her own son's life. Owen's 12th birthday party. Scott had wanted something simple, a few friends, pizza, maybe laser tag. But Doris had other plans, as she always did. She'd already arranged for the event to be held at the Burnett family estate in Westchester, already invited her bridge club friends and their grandchildren, already planned a menu that no 12-year-old would touch. When Scott had tried to object, Marguerite had placed a hand on his arm, her eyes pleading, "Pick your battles." He'd picked this one years ago. He just hadn't revealed his hand yet. The manuscript before him was the 5th novel he'd completed since leaving Morrison & Drake. The first 2 had received polite rejection letters. The 3rd had found a small publisher and sold moderately well. The 4th had caught the attention of a larger house. And this 5th one, the one he'd poured 3 years of his life into, had done something unexpected. Scott pulled open his desk drawer and retrieved the letter. He'd read it so many times in the past 2 weeks that the creases were beginning to wear thin. The letterhead belonged to Meridian Studios. The offer inside represented more money than he would have made in 15 years at Morrison & Drake. But more than that, it represented vindication, validation, proof that the dream Doris had mocked at every holiday dinner, every school event, every casual encounter, had been worth pursuing. He hadn't told Marguerite yet. That decision had cost him sleep, had made him feel like a stranger in his own home. But he'd learned to be strategic in this family, to hold his cards close. Doris had taught him that, ironically, with every power play, every manipulation, every time she'd dangled financial support only to weaponize it later. The college fund she'd promised Owen since birth had come with strings, invisible but strong, binding the boy's future to the grandmother's approval. Last month, Owen had mentioned wanting to study creative writing in college. The silence at the dinner table had been deafening. Doris had set down her wine glass with deliberate care and said, "We'll discuss that when you're old enough to understand real career prospects." Then she turned to Chester, Owen's cousin, who'd just declared his intention to study business at Wharton and spent 20 minutes extolling the virtues of his choice. Chester Burnett was 19, the son of Doris's late brother, raised by her after his parents died in a car accident when he was 8. Doris had poured her considerable resources into making Chester her legacy project. Private schools, summer programs, tutors. Owen often joked, with the forced humor of a kid trying to mask hurt, that Chester was the grandson Doris actually wanted. Scott stood and walked to the window, watching the street below. A kid rode by on a bike, careening around a corner with the fearless abandon of youth. He remembered Owen at that age, before the weight of expectations and comparisons had settled on his shoulders. Before every school achievement was measured against Chester's accomplishments. Before every interest was evaluated for its earning potential and family appropriateness. Tomorrow would change things. Tomorrow, Scott would show his son the letter, but only after Doris had played her final card. He'd been collecting evidence for months, recordings of belittling comments, documentation of the conditional gifts that came with ultimatums, witness accounts from friends who'd seen the damage. But his real weapon was simpler. He no longer needed the Bunnett's money, and neither did Owen. The freedom that knowledge provided was intoxicating. His phone buzzed again. This time it was Owen. "Can we not do the big party? Please?" Scott's heart clenched. His son shouldn't have to beg to enjoy his own birthday. He typed back, "Trust me. Tomorrow will be memorable. I promise." Three dots appeared, then disappeared. Then, "Okay, Dad. I trust you." Those four words carried more weight than any contract Scott had reviewed in his legal career. His son trusted him. That trust had sustained them through years of subtle undermining, of watching Marguerite struggle between loyalty to her mother and loyalty to her family, of Owen trying desperately to earn affection that was always just out of reach. The Burnett estate loomed before them the next morning, all manicured hedges and ostentatious iron gates. Scott had always thought the house looked like it was trying too hard. The columned entrance, the circular driveway with its centerpiece fountain, the sprawling lawn that required a team of gardeners. It was a monument to wealth that needed to be seen, acknowledged, envied. Doris stood on the front steps, directing caterers with the authority of a general deploying troops. At 68, she maintained the sharp elegance of someone who'd spent a lifetime cultivating appearance. Her silver hair was styled in a perfect bob, her cream pantsuit immaculate. She spotted their car and her expression shifted into what Scott called her public face. Warm smile, open arms, the grandmother everyone envied. "There's my birthday boy." She descended the steps as Owen climbed out of the car, enveloping him in a hug that looked perfect for the Instagram post Scott knew would follow. 12 years old. Practically a man. Owen returned the hug with the dutiful affection of someone who'd learned early that enthusiasm earned rewards. "Thanks, Grandma. Chester's inside. He drove up from school, just for you." Doris's hand remained on Owen's shoulder, steering him toward the house. "He's been asking about you. I think he wants to talk about college, give you some guidance." Scott caught the flicker of resignation in his son's eyes. Guidance from Chester meant lectures about practical choices and not wasting your potential. He moved to follow, but Doris turned, her smile cooling just enough to signal dismissal. "Scott, could you help the caterers with those tables? They're setting up in the wrong section." It wasn't a question. Marguerite touched his arm. "I'll go with Owen." He watched them disappear into the house, his wife and son absorbed into the Burnett domain where he'd always been an outsider. The hired help with a law degree he'd thrown away. The disappointment who'd seduced their daughter and daughter-in-law into a life of struggle and unfulfilled potential. Scott headed toward the caterers, but his mind was elsewhere. He thought about the letter folded in his jacket pocket, about the phone call he'd scheduled for later that afternoon, about the expression that would cross Doris's face when she realized her power had been an illusion all along. A voice pulled him from his thoughts. "You must be Scott." He turned to find a man in his mid-50s extending a hand. Silver temples, expensive watch, the easy confidence of inherited wealth. "Richard Armstrong. I handle the Burnett family's financial matters." Scott shook his hand, recognizing the name. Doris had mentioned him before, her trusted advisor, the man who'd helped her protect the family assets after her husband's death. "Scott Cook, though I suspect you know that." "Indeed." Richard's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Doris speaks of you often." "I'm sure she does. She's concerned about Owen's future, about ensuring he has the right guidance." Richard gestured toward the house. "She asked me to prepare some documents. For the college fund. She wants everything formalized today." So that was the play. Scott had suspected something was coming, but having it confirmed sent a spike of anger through his chest. Formalized how? Just ensuring the funds are distributed appropriately. For Owen's benefit, of course. Richard pulled an envelope from his jacket. "Perhaps we could discuss this privately?" Before the party, Scott took the envelope, feeling the weight of what he suspected were contingency clauses, behavioral requirements, career stipulations. Everything Doris did came with a contract, whether written or implied. Control disguised as generosity. "I'll review these," Scott said, his voice even. "Thank you for bringing them." Richard hesitated, as if expecting more resistance. When none came, he nodded. "Doris will want to make the announcement during the cake. She's planned something special." Something special. Scott's grip on the envelope tightened. Whatever Doris had planned, whatever power move she thought would cement her control over Owen's future, she'd miscalculated. For the first time in 13 years, Scott held better cards. He just needed to wait for the right moment to play them. Inside the house, he found Owen in the den with Chester, who'd grown into a replica of Doris. Same sharp features, same calculated charm, same ability to make you feel inferior while smiling. Chester was mid-speech about his internship at a hedge fund, gesturing expansively while Owen sat on the couch, nodding with practiced politeness. "There's my little cousin," Chester said when he spotted Scott. "Just explaining to Owen here about the importance of market trends and financial literacy. You know, real-world stuff." "Appreciated," Scott said, keeping his tone neutral. "Owen, can I talk to you for a minute?" Relief flashed across his son's face. "Sure, Dad." They stepped into the hallway, away from Chester's self-important monologue. Owen's shoulders sagged the moment they were alone. 3 more hours of this. About that. Scott crouched to Owen's eye level, studying the face that had Marguerite's eyes and his own stubborn chin. "I need you to do something for me today. No matter what happens, no matter what anyone says, I need you to trust me. Can you do that?" Owen's expression shifted from tired resignation to curiosity. "What's going to happen?" "Let's just say your grandmother has a surprise planned, and I have one too." Scott squeezed his son's shoulder. "Yours is better." A smile tugged at Owen's lips, the first genuine one Scott had seen all morning. "Is this about why you've been so secretive lately?" "Maybe. And why you and Mom have been weird around each other." Scott's chest tightened. He hadn't realized Owen had noticed the strain between him and Marguerite. The way their conversations had become careful and surface level since he'd made his decision to wait. "Your mom and I are fine. We're just navigating some complicated family stuff." "Grandma stuff, you mean?" Out of the mouths of babes. "Yeah, grandma stuff." Owen glanced back toward the den where Chester's voice droned on. "Sometimes I wish things were different. Like, why does everything have to be about money and college and impressing people? Why can't it just be about, I don't know, being happy?" "It can be," Scott said, the words carrying more promise than Owen could understand yet. "It will be." The party swelled through the afternoon. Doris's bridge club arrived in a convoy of luxury sedans, each woman competing in a silent war of designer handbags and subtle cosmetic enhancements. They descended on Owen with the enthusiasm of people fulfilling a social obligation, complimenting his height, his manners, his resemblance to dear Chester. Owen accepted their attention with the grace of someone twice his age, smiling and thanking them while his eyes searched for escape routes. Scott watched from the periphery, nursing a beer he'd barely touched. Marguerite moved through the crowd with practiced ease, playing the role of gracious daughter and hostess. She'd worn the dress Doris had bought her last Christmas, cream with subtle gold threading, elegant but not attention-grabbing. "Safe." "Approved." He caught her eye once across the lawn, and something passed between them, a moment of recognition, of shared exhaustion. Then Doris materialized at her elbow with another bridge club friend, and Marguerite's smile snapped back into place. "Your wife's a treasure," a voice said beside him. Scott turned to find another of Doris's circle, a woman named Vivian Nelson whose grandson was in Owen's grade. So patient with Doris's enthusiasm. Patient was a diplomatic word for it. "She does her best." "Must be hard, though." Vivian's gaze was sharp behind her designer sunglasses. "Being married to someone who gave up such a promising career. I heard you were quite the attorney before you decided to chase the writing thing." "The writing thing." Scott had heard variations of this dismissal for 5 years. "I'm still a licensed attorney. Just not practicing." "Right. Because the novel writing is going so well." Vivian's smile could have cut glass. "Doris mentioned you're working on your, what is it, 5th? 6th book?" Such dedication to a hobby. Before Scott could respond, a commotion near the house drew everyone's attention. Chester had emerged with several of his university friends, all designer polo shirts and expensive watches and the casual arrogance of young men who'd never faced real consequences. They carried cases of craft beer and a bottle of what looked like high-end whiskey. "The party's here," Chester announced, to scattered laughter from his group. Scott saw Owen's face fall. This was supposed to be his party, but it was being absorbed into Chester's orbit like everything else in the Burnett universe. His son stood near the dessert table, surrounded by kids his own age, but looking more isolated than if he'd been alone. Doris appeared at Chester's side, laughing at something one of his friends said. She hooked her arm through her pseudo-grandson's, the picture of pride and affection. The contrast with how she treated Owen, dutiful but distant, loving but conditional, burned in Scott's gut. Marguerite materialized beside him, her voice low. "Are you going to say something?" "Not yet." "Scott, trust me." She studied his face, searching for something. Whatever she found there made her frown. "What are you planning?" "What I should have done years ago." Before she could respond, Doris's voice rang out across the lawn. "Everyone, could I have your attention, please?" She stood on the patio steps, Chester beside her, commanding the crowd with the ease of someone accustomed to being heard. "I know we're all here to celebrate Owen's special day, but I have an announcement that I think makes this occasion even more meaningful." Scott's muscles tensed. Here it came. The power play he'd been expecting, the reminder of who controlled the purse strings and therefore the future. He glanced at Owen, who'd gone very still, a rabbit sensing a predator. "As many of you know," Doris continued, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent lawn, "my late husband and I established college funds for both of our grandchildren. We believe deeply in education and investing in the next generation's success." Richard Armstrong had materialized beside Doris, holding a folder that Scott recognized as containing the documents he'd been given earlier. The ones he hadn't signed. The ones he'd read and found riddled with clauses that would give Doris control over every aspect of Owen's education and career choice. "Chester has proven himself to be everything we hoped, driven, ambitious, committed to excellence. He's made us so proud." Doris's hand rested on Chester's shoulder. "Owen, on the other hand, has been exploring his options, talking about creative writing, about following passions rather than practical paths." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Some of the Bridge Club women exchanged glances. Scott saw the moment his son's face crumbled, the public humiliation landing like a physical blow. After much consideration and discussion with our financial advisor, Doris's voice took on a tone of regretful necessity. "We've decided to consolidate the college funds. Chester will receive the full amount to ensure his path to Wharton and beyond is secure. Owen," she paused, letting the silence build, "Owen will have access to state school tuition, provided he chooses a practical major. Business, perhaps, or following in his father's original footsteps, law." The words hung in the air like poison. State school, practical major. The implicit message was clear. You're not good enough, smart enough, worthy enough for the investment we made in Chester. Your dreams are luxuries we won't finance. Owen's face had gone white. Kids his age stared, some with pity, others with the cruel interest of spectators at an accident. Chester wore an expression of false humility, but Scott caught the glint of satisfaction in his eyes. "He doesn't deserve it anyway," Doris added, her voice softening as if she were delivering mercy rather than cruelty. "Not unless he's willing to grow up and make responsible choices." The crowd murmured, some approving, others uncertain. Vivian Nelson leaned to her companion and whispered something that made them both nod. Marguerite's hand had flown to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror, but she didn't speak, didn't object, didn't defend her son. Owen's legs seemed to buckle. He turned and ran, pushing through the crowd, heading for the house. The slam of a door echoed across the lawn. The room, the party, the gathered assembly of Burnett wealth and influence, went completely quiet. Scott waited 3 heartbeats. 4. Let them sit in the discomfort of what they'd just witnessed. Let them remember this moment. Then he set down his beer and followed his son, saying nothing to them. Not a word to Doris, not a glance at Chester, not even acknowledgement of Marguerite's whispered, "Scott, wait." He found Owen in an upstairs guest room, curled on the bed, his face pressed into a pillow to muffle the sobs that shook his shoulders. Scott closed the door behind him and sat on the edge of the bed, his hand resting on his son's back. "I'm sorry." Owen's voice was muffled, broken. "I'm sorry I'm such a disappointment." The words shattered something in Scott's chest. "You listen to me." He waited until Owen turned to face him, tears streaming down his face. "You are not a disappointment. You are not unworthy. You are not less than Chester or anyone else in that crowd. But Grandma, your grandmother just made the biggest mistake of her life." Scott pulled the letter from his jacket pocket, the creases worn but the words still sharp and clear. "I've been waiting to show you this. I was going to wait until later, make it more dramatic, but I think you need to see it now." Owen took the letter with shaking hands, his eyes scanning the Meridian Studios letterhead, the figures that followed, the words film adaptation rights, and 7-figure advance, and international distribution. Scott watched his son's expression transform. Shock, confusion, slowly dawning comprehension. This is real. Very real. The book I've been working on for 3 years? A studio bought it. Not just bought it, they're turning it into a film. And they paid enough money that you could go to any college you want. Study whatever you want. Your grandmother's college fund. Scott kept his voice steady, controlled. We don't need it. We've never needed it. But Owen's mind was clearly racing, trying to process. Why didn't you tell anyone? Because I needed to know something first. Scott took his son's hands. I needed to know that when the mask came off, when Doris showed her true colors, everyone would see it. I needed witnesses to the cruelty, the manipulation, the control. And I needed you to see that her approval, her money, her conditions, none of it matters. You're going to succeed not because of the Bunnets, but in spite of them. Owen stared at the letter, his tears still falling, but for different reasons now. His hands trembled as he read it again, as if afraid the words would disappear. Dad, does this mean really? Really? Scott pulled his son into a hug. You can study creative writing. You can go to whatever school accepts you based on your merit. You can tell your grandmother exactly what she can do with her conditional love. Owen pulled back, and Scott saw something new in his eyes. Not just relief or joy, but something harder. Anger. Righteous fury at the years of being made to feel less than, of watching his dreams be dismissed, of competing for affection that should have been freely given. The boy was becoming someone who wouldn't forget this moment, who would use it as fuel. I want to show them, Owen said, his voice steadier than it had been all day. I want them to know. Scott smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. Then let's go downstairs. They descended the stairs together, father and son, united in purpose. The party had resumed in their absence, but the energy was muted, uncomfortable. People stood in clusters, speaking in low voices. Doris held court near the patio, Richard Armstrong beside her, Chester entertaining his friends. Marguerite stood alone by the dessert table, looking lost. Owen walked straight through the crowd, the letter clutched in his hand. People noticed him, the conversations dying as he passed. By the time he reached the patio steps where Doris stood, everyone was watching. Grandma. Owen's voice carried across the lawn, stronger than Scott had ever heard it. I have something to say. Doris turned, her expression shifting from surprise to calculated concern. Owen, sweetheart, I know you're upset, but this decision is for your own good. Dad sold his book. Owen held up the letter. To a film studio. For more money than your college fund. For more money than you've ever given anyone. The crowd rippled with shock. Doris's face went very still. What? It means I don't need your money. It means I can study whatever I want. It means... Owen's voice cracked slightly, but he pushed through. It means you can't control me anymore. Scott stepped forward, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. He met Doris's eyes across the space between them and saw the moment her world tilted. All her carefully constructed power, her leverage, her ability to dictate terms, gone in an instant. 7 figures, Scott said quietly, but in the silence, everyone heard him. International distribution rights. They're already talking about a trilogy. Vivian Nelson let out a small laugh, surprise, and something like delight. The Bridge Club women exchanged looks that were no longer pitying. Chester's smile had frozen on his face. Richard Armstrong's expression suggested he was rapidly recalculating financial scenarios. Marguerite moved through the crowd, her heels clicking on stone. She reached Owen and pulled him into a fierce hug, and Scott saw that she was crying. I'm so sorry, she whispered, but loud enough for others to hear. I'm so sorry I didn't stop her. Doris's face had gone through several colors. Red, then white, then a mottled combination of both. This is, you've been lying to us. Keeping secrets. Making us think. Making you think you had power you didn't earn. Scott interrupted, his voice cutting. Making you believe that money equaled love, that conditions equaled care. I didn't lie, Doris. I just didn't share information with someone who spent 13 years proving she couldn't be trusted with it. How dare you speak to me like that in my own home? Your home that I was never welcome in anyway. Scott felt 13 years of calculated silence break open. Your home where my son was made to feel like a charity case. Where every gift came with strings. Where love was transactional and approval had to be earned through obedience. The crowd had gone completely silent. This was scandal, gossip, the kind of family implosion usually hidden behind closed doors. Several phones had appeared, discreetly filming. By tomorrow, this would be all over Westchester social media. Chester stepped forward, his face ugly with anger. You've been playing us? setting us up for some kind of revenge fantasy. I've been documenting abuse, Scott corrected. There's a difference. And for the record, Chester, that college fund you just inherited, enjoy it. Because you're going to need every penny when you realize that Doris's approval is the only thing you have. No personality, no real skills, just an elderly woman's money and unfulfilled dreams projected onto you. Chester's hands clenched into fists. For a moment, Scott thought he might actually swing. Let him. In front of all these witnesses. Let everyone see the real character behind the golden boy image. But Richard Armstrong placed a hand on Chester's arm, restraining him. The lawyer's mind was clearly working, calculating consequences, legal ramifications. I think, he said carefully, this might be a good time for everyone to leave. Excellent idea, Scott agreed. He looked at Owen. Birthday boy's call. Do you want to stay? Owen looked at the assembled crowd, the bridge club women whispering, the university friends awkward and uncertain, the kids his own age staring with mixed expressions. Then he looked at his grandmother, who'd gone very still and pale, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. No, Owen said simply. I want to go home. Then we go home. Scott turned to Marguerite. You coming? She didn't hesitate. Yes. They walked through the crowd together, a family unit for the first time in years. Behind them, Doris's voice rose, shrill and demanding. If you leave now, you're not welcome back. Do you hear me? Not in this house, not in this family. Scott didn't turn around. We hear you, Doris. We just don't care anymore. The drive home was silent for the first 5 minutes. Then Owen, sitting in the back seat, let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. Did that really just happen? Marguerite twisted in her seat, reaching back to take her son's hand. It happened. And Dad's book is really going to be a movie? Really, really, Scott confirmed, catching his son's eyes in the rearview mirror. Shooting starts next spring. They want me involved in the screenplay adaptation. It's going to be a whole thing. Why didn't you tell us? Marguerite's voice was quiet, hurt beneath the question. Scott's hands tightened on the wheel. Because I needed to know something. I needed to know if, when the moment came, you would choose us or her. The silence stretched. Then Marguerite's voice, barely a whisper. I chose wrong for too long, didn't I? Yeah. Scott didn't soften it. You did. I'm sorry. She was crying now, quiet tears that she didn't try to hide. I'm so sorry. Both of you. I let her make me into someone I hate. Owen leaned forward, his hand on his mother's shoulder. We can fix it, right? All of us together. Scott thought about the years of damage, the moments of betrayal, the times Marguerite had stood silent while Doris diminished their son. Thought about the woman he'd married versus the woman she'd become under her mother's influence. The gap between them seemed vast. But he also thought about the choice she'd made today. Walking away from the Burnett estate, from her mother's approval, from the comfortable prison she'd lived in. That had to count for something. Yeah, he said finally. We can try. They pulled into their driveway, the modest house in a middle-class neighborhood that Doris had always looked at with thinly veiled disdain. Scott had never been more grateful for it. This was theirs. Bought with his law firm's salary before he'd quit, maintained through careful budgeting and Marguerite's part-time work. No strings attached. No conditions. Just a home. Inside, Owen went straight to his room to call his best friend, his voice animated as he recounted the afternoon's drama. Scott and Marguerite stood in the kitchen, the space between them filled with things unsaid. I've been a coward, Marguerite said finally. I kept thinking if I just kept the peace, if I managed everyone's expectations, it would get better. But it only got worse. She's toxic, Marguerite. She always has been. I know. Marguerite's hands twisted together. I think I've always known. But admitting it meant admitting I'd wasted years trying to earn something that was never going to be freely given. It meant accepting that my mother doesn't actually love me. She loves the idea of me when I'm compliant. Scott wanted to stay angry. Wanted to hold on to the years of frustration, the moments when he'd needed his wife to stand with him and she'd chosen her mother instead. But he also saw the woman he'd fallen for beginning to emerge from beneath the layers of conditioning and fear. What happens now? She asked. Now we figure out who we are without the bonnet's shadow over us. Scott pulled out his phone, pulling up an email he'd received that morning. The studio wants to meet next week. They're talking about a 3-book deal, with options for film rights on all of them. It's more money than we'll need. More opportunities than I imagined. You did it. Marguerite's smile was sad and proud simultaneously. You chased your dream, and it worked. I got lucky. Right place, right story, right time. No. She shook her head firmly. You worked for it. You believed in it when everyone, including me, told you it was foolish. You earned this, Scott. The words settled something in his chest. Vindication had a weight to it, a substance that filled spaces he hadn't realized were empty. Upstairs, they heard Owen's voice rise in excitement. Then his laughter, genuine and unforced. The sound made them both smile. He's going to be okay, Marguerite said. Better than okay. Scott looked at his wife. We all are. She stepped closer, tentative, and he didn't pull away. They had a long road ahead, rebuilding trust, redefining their marriage outside of her mother's influence, learning to be a family unit rather than survivors of the same war. But today, for the first time in years, that road felt possible to travel. I'm still angry, Scott said honestly. About all of it. About the times you didn't stand up, didn't protect Owen, didn't choose us. I know. You should be. Marguerite's eyes met his. I'm angry at myself too. But I'm also done. Done letting her control us. Done being afraid of losing her approval. I meant what I showed back there. I'm choosing you and Owen. Finally. Actions, Marguerite. Not just words. I know. She pulled out her phone, her fingers trembling slightly as she typed. Scott watched over her shoulder as she composed a message to her mother. What you did today was cruel and unforgivable. Until you can acknowledge that and genuinely apologize, not just to Scott, but to Owen, we won't be in contact. Your money and your conditions have no power over us anymore. We're done. She hit send before she could second-guess herself. The phone immediately buzzed with an incoming call, Doris's name flashing across the screen. Marguerite declined it and blocked the number. There, she said, her voice shaking but determined. First step. Scott's anger didn't disappear, but it shifted, made room for something else. Hope, maybe. Or just the possibility of it. Owen appeared in the kitchen doorway, his phone still in his hand. Dad? Jake wants to know if the movie will have superheroes in it. Different kind of story, Scott laughed. More psychological thriller than action. Still cool, though. Owen's grin was infectious. And Dad, thanks. For today. For everything. You don't need to thank me for having your back, kid. That's what fathers do. Not all of them. Owen's eyes flicked to his mother, then back. But the good ones do. Marguerite made a small sound, half sob, half laugh. She pulled Owen into a hug, whispering apologies he probably didn't fully understand, but accepted anyway. Kids were resilient like that, able to forgive when given genuine cause to. That evening, they ordered pizza, Owen's choice, and ate it in front of the TV, watching some mindless action movie that required no deep thought. It felt like rebellion, like claiming space that had been denied them. Every family gathering at the Burnett estate had been formal affairs with catered food and prescribed conversation topics. This was gloriously ordinary. Around 9, Scott's phone buzzed with a text from a number he didn't recognize. This is Richard Armstrong. I think we should talk. About the documents and other matters. Not as Doris's representative. As someone who's seen enough to have concerns. Scott stared at the message, his mind working through implications. Richard had been present for years of family manipulation. He'd drafted the controlling documents, facilitated the conditional gifts. But he'd also been there today, had seen Doris at her worst, had witnessed the public unmasking. He showed the text to Marguerite. What do you think? I think, she said slowly, that people who enable toxicity sometimes have their own wake-up calls. Maybe today was his. Scott typed back, my office. Monday at 10 a.m. He provided the address, a small rented space in downtown that served more as a writing sanctuary than an actual office, but it was professional enough. I'll be there, came the response. Could be a trap, Scott said. Could be an opportunity, Marguerite countered. Richard knows things. About the estate, about Doris's finances, about years of family history. If he's having second thoughts about who he's been working for, then we listen. Scott pocketed his phone. But carefully. Monday morning arrived with the crisp efficiency of a new beginning. Scott dressed in one of his old law firm suits, the fabric reminding him of who he'd been before he'd chosen a different path. Richard arrived precisely at 10, looking tired in a way that suggested he'd spent the weekend in deep contemplation. Thank you for seeing me, Richard said, settling into the chair across from Scott's desk. I'll admit I'm curious about what brings Doris Burnett's financial advisor to my office. Former advisor, as of yesterday. Richard's expression was weary. I resigned. Effective immediately. That was unexpected. Because of Saturday? Because of 13 years of Saturdays. Richard pulled out a folder. I've been enabling someone I no longer recognize, or perhaps someone I finally see clearly. What she did to your son, that was unconscionable. But it wasn't new. It was just the most public display of a pattern I'd been helping facilitate. Scott leaned back in his chair, studying the man across from him. So this is guilt talking. Guilt. Conscience. Whatever you want to call it. Richard opened the folder. I can't undo what's been done, but I can provide you with information. About the college fund structure, about other financial manipulations, about conversations I've had with Doris regarding you and your family. Why would you do that? Attorney-client privilege. Doesn't apply when I've witnessed potential financial abuse and coercive control. Richard's jaw set firmly. I'm prepared to testify to that if needed. The documents I prepared, the conditions embedded in gifts, the way funds were structured to maximize control. It's all ethically questionable at best, illegal at worst. Scott felt the pieces clicking into place. This wasn't just guilt. This was a man covering his own liability, protecting himself from potential blowback. But that didn't mean the information wasn't valuable. What specifically are we talking about? The college fund Doris controlled? It was never solely her money. Your father-in-law set it up with specific instructions that it be divided equally between grandchildren, no conditions attached. After he died, Doris had me restructure it, adding codicils that gave her discretionary power. Technically legal, but against his clearly stated wishes. So Chester's inheritance is built on betraying his grandfather's intent. Essentially, yes. Richard slid papers across the desk. But there's more. Doris has been systematically isolating Marguerite financially. Joint accounts that became Doris-controlled, inheritance from her father that was managed by Doris with fees that far exceeded industry standards, pressure to remain financially dependent. It's a classic pattern of economic abuse. Scott's hands clenched. He'd suspected some of this, but hearing it laid out so clinically made his blood boil. Does Marguerite know? I doubt it. Doris was careful to frame everything as help, as protection, as family taking care of family. Richard met Scott's eyes. I helped her do it. I'm not proud of that, but I can help you undo it if you want. What's the catch? No catch. Just, Richard hesitated. I need to believe I can still do the right thing. That I haven't spent 13 years being complicit in something ugly without the ability to correct course. Scott considered. Richard's motivations were selfish, redemption, protection from liability, easing of conscience. But the information was valuable, and the enemy of my enemy. All right. I want full documentation of the college fund restructuring, copies of any communications where Doris discussed controlling Marguerite or influencing our family decisions, and a detailed breakdown of how my father-in-law's estate was really distributed versus what we were told. You'll have it by Wednesday. Richard stood, extending his hand. For what it's worth, Mr. Cook, your son deserved better than what he got Saturday. So did you. After Richard left, Scott sat in the silence of his office, thinking about power and its many forms. Doris had wielded money as her weapon, but she'd underestimated the power of independence, of choosing authenticity over approval. Her control had always been an illusion, sustained only by those who believed in it. Wednesday brought the promised documentation. Scott spread it across his desk, Marguerite beside him, reading through years of careful manipulation laid bare on paper. She forged Dad's signature. Marguerite's voice was hollow. On the amendments to the college fund. Look, the date is 2 weeks after he died, but it's supposedly his instruction. Scott examined the document, seeing what Richard's annotated notes highlighted. The handwriting analysis alone would prove forgery, but there were other tells, references to events that happened after her father's death, terminology he never used. She committed fraud, Marguerite continued, her hands shaking. She stole from her own grandchildren and blamed it on their grandfather's wishes, and used it to control everyone for over a decade. Scott's voice was grim. The question is, what do we do with this information? Marguerite was quiet for a long moment, staring at the papers that proved her mother's betrayal. We could press charges. Fraud, forgery, maybe even embezzlement depending on how the estate was structured. We could. Scott watched his wife's face, seeing the war between hurt and hesitation. Or we use it as leverage to make sure she never tries to control us again. Show her we have the evidence. Make it clear that any attempt to interfere in our lives or Owen's future will result in legal action and public exposure. That's the diplomatic approach. It's the one that keeps our family out of a prolonged legal battle. Marguerite met his eyes. I'm done with my mother, Scott. But I also don't want the next 5 years of our lives consumed by litigation and media attention. I want us to move forward, not stay trapped in the past. Scott understood. The vindictive part of him wanted to see Doris face consequences, wanted the public humiliation of a trial, wanted everyone who'd witnessed Saturday's party to know the full extent of her manipulations. But the practical part, the part that had learned to think strategically, recognized that sometimes the best revenge was simply living well, unburdened. All right, we meet with her, show her what we have, make our terms clear. No contact unless she can apologize genuinely and respect boundaries. No financial control or influence over Owen. No more manipulative gifts or conditional support. And if she refuses, then we make her comfortable controlling what little she has left, her estate, her bridge club reputation, her golden boy Chester. Scott's smile was sharp. Without us, she's lost her primary targets. Sometimes the worst punishment is irrelevance. They scheduled a meeting for the following week at a neutral location, a lawyer's conference room that Scott borrowed from an old law school friend. Doris arrived exactly on time, dressed in tailored elegance that screamed power and control. Chester accompanied her, as did a lawyer Scott didn't recognize, probably someone Richard had recommended before his departure. I don't appreciate being summoned, Doris began, settling into her chair with the air of someone granting an audience rather than attending a meeting. And I don't appreciate my son being publicly humiliated, Scott countered, keeping his voice level. Yet here we are. You humiliated yourself with that little display at Owen's party. Keeping secrets, lying about your finances. I didn't lie. I simply didn't share information with someone who'd proven she couldn't be trusted. Scott slid the first folder across the table. Speaking of lies, let's talk about your father's estate, Marguerite. Marguerite picked up where he left off, her voice steadier than Scott expected. These documents show that you forged Dad's signature on amendments to the college fund, that you restructured his estate against his explicit wishes, that you've been systematically controlling money that was meant to be mine and using it as leverage. Doris's face went carefully blank, but Scott saw the flicker of fear in her eyes. Beside her, Chester leaned forward to examine the documents, his expression darkening. These are fabrications, Doris said, but her voice lacked conviction. They're notarized documents from your own financial advisor, along with his sworn statement about the fraud. Scott's tone was matter of fact. Richard Armstrong has already provided testimony to an attorney who's prepared to file if we give the word. The lawyer Doris had brought looked increasingly uncomfortable, flipping through the papers with growing alarm. He leaned over to whisper something to Doris, whose pale face flushed red. You drag your own family through a public trial? Expose all of this. You dragged our son through a public humiliation, Marguerite said. You spent 13 years making us feel small, worthless, dependent. Yes, Mother, I would absolutely expose this. You left us no choice by refusing to see us as anything other than chess pieces in your control games. Chester had gone very quiet, reading through the documents with dawning comprehension. Grandma, these dates, this signature. You told me grandfather wanted the college fund consolidated, that it was his idea to invest more in my future. It was his idea, Chester. These documents are. Stop. Chester's voice was sharp. Just stop. I've watched you manipulate everyone for years, told myself it was just your way of caring. But this. He held up one of the forged documents. This is fraud. This is criminal. You ungrateful. No. Chester stood abruptly. I'm done. Owen's party was bad enough, but this? I won't be part of this anymore. He looked at Scott and Marguerite. I'm sorry. For all of it. I should have said something years ago. He walked out, leaving Doris staring after him with an expression of pure shock. Her golden boy, her legacy project, abandoning her. These are our terms, Scott said, pulling Doris's attention back. You leave us alone. No contact with Owen unless he initiates it. No financial manipulation. No attempts to control or influence our lives. In exchange, these documents stay private. And if I refuse? Then we file charges, and the story of Doris Burnett's fraud against her own family becomes public record. Every bridge club friend, every society contact, every person who witnessed Saturday's disaster, they'll all know the full truth. Doris's lawyer cleared his throat. Mrs. Burnett, I strongly advise you to accept these terms. The evidence here is substantial, and the publicity would be. I understand what the publicity would be, Doris snapped. She turned back to Scott and Marguerite, and for the first time, Scott saw her truly beaten. All her carefully constructed power, all her leverage, gone. Fine. Your terms. But don't come crawling back when you need. We won't need anything from you. Marguerite interrupted. That's the entire point, Mother. We never did. You just convinced me I was incapable without your help. But I'm done believing that. They left Doris sitting in the conference room, diminished and alone with her lawyer. In the parking lot, Marguerite let out a shaky breath. I can't believe Chester walked out. He's not a bad kid, Scott said. Just one raised by someone who taught him the wrong values. Maybe this is his wake-up call too. Maybe. Marguerite leaned against their car. Is it wrong that I feel relieved? Like a weight's been lifted? That's called freedom. Scott pulled her into a hug. Congratulations on finding it. The months that followed brought changes that rippled through every aspect of their lives. The movie production started, bringing Scott into a world of scripts and locations and creative decisions that felt surreal and exhilarating. The advance and subsequent payments meant financial security they'd never known. Not wealth on Doris's scale, but comfortable, independent, untethered. Owen threw himself into his writing with renewed passion, no longer weighed down by the expectation that his interests were frivolous. His English teacher connected him with a young adult writing program, and by fall, he'd completed his first short story collection. Marguerite returned to school herself, enrolling in a graduate program in counseling psychology. I want to help people recognize toxic family dynamics, she explained to Scott over dinner one night. I wasted so many years not seeing what was right in front of me. Maybe I can help others not make the same mistakes. Chester reached out 3 months after the confrontation, asking to meet for coffee. Scott agreed, curious about the young man who'd walked away from his grandmother's control. I'm transferring schools, Chester said, stirring his latte with nervous energy. Not Wharton. Somewhere I actually want to go, studying something I care about, environmental science. Good for you. I'm also seeing a therapist. Turns out being raised by Doris did a number on my head. Chester's smile was rueful. Who knew conditional love and constant comparison could create issues? Everyone who wasn't Doris, probably. Yeah. Chester met Scott's eyes. I want to apologize. For being part of the problem. For benefiting from the way she treated Owen. For not speaking up sooner. I was so caught up in being the golden child that I didn't see how toxic it all was. You were a kid raised in a difficult situation. You're not responsible for Doris's choices. Scott paused. But you are responsible for your own. Moving forward, what kind of person do you want to be? The kind who doesn't make love conditional. Who doesn't measure worth by achievements or bank accounts. Chester's jaw set with determination that reminded Scott of Marguerite when she'd finally chosen her family. The kind who would have defended Owen instead of standing silently while he was humiliated. That's a good start. They met regularly after that. Not quite friends, but working towards something like family without Doris's poisonous influence. Chester visited for Christmas, bringing thoughtful gifts and genuine interest in Owen's writing. The brothers, cousins, really, but brothers in the ways that mattered, began to build a relationship free from competition and comparison. Doris herself remained absent, a silent presence defined by her absence. Occasionally, Marguerite received reports through distant relatives. Doris had become increasingly isolated, her bridge club less interested in someone whose family drama had become public spectacle. The estate that had once been the center of social gatherings sat quiet, as if even the house had withdrawn from the world. Do you ever feel guilty? Marguerite asked Scott one evening, a year after Owen's disastrous birthday party. About how things ended? No. Scott's answer was immediate and honest. She made her choices. We simply stopped enabling them. But she's alone now. Isolated. By her own design. We didn't isolate her. We just refused to be controlled. There's a difference. Scott took his wife's hand. If she wanted different results, she could apologize. She could acknowledge the harm she caused. She could try to build genuine relationships instead of transactional ones. She hasn't done any of that. I know. Marguerite's eyes were sad. She's still my mother. And you're still her daughter. But you're also Owen's mother, my wife, and your own person. Those relationships deserve your priority. 2 years after the birthday party, Owen's first short story won a young writers competition with a prize that included publication in a national magazine. The story, a thinly veiled account of a boy learning to value himself independent of his family's expectations, resonated with judges and readers alike. Scott framed the published piece and hung it in Owen's room, next to the Meridian Studios contract that had changed their lives. 2 pieces of paper that represented freedom, validation, and the courage to choose authenticity over approval. Dad, Owen stood in the doorway, looking at the frames. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if the book hadn't sold? If we'd actually needed Grandma's college fund? Every day, Scott pulled his son into a side hug. But I like to think we'd have found another way. The money was important, but what mattered more was refusing to let her define our worth. I used to think I needed her to love me, Owen admitted. That if I could just be good enough, smart enough, whatever enough, she'd see me the way she saw Chester. And now I know that was never about me. It was about her and what she needed to believe about herself and her control over everyone around her. Owen's voice carried wisdom beyond his 14 years. I feel sorry for her, actually. She could have had a real relationship with me, with you and Mom. Instead, she has an empty house and a reputation for being cruel. Scott thought about Doris and her estate, surrounded by material wealth, but starved for genuine connection. Thought about the bridge club friends who'd drifted away, the family members who'd distanced themselves after the truth came out, the lawyer who'd resigned rather than continue enabling her behavior. She'd built a kingdom of control and found it to be a prison. Some people, Scott said carefully, never learn that love can't be commanded or purchased. They spend their whole lives trying to force others into compliance and wonder why they end up alone. The premiere of the film adaptation arrived with Hollywood fanfare that felt surreal to a family from modest suburbs. Scott walked the red carpet with Marguerite and Owen, cameras flashing, reporters asking questions about his overnight success that had actually taken 5 years of persistent work. Owen wore a suit that made him look older than his years, his confidence born from knowing his worth wasn't tied to external validation. Marguerite radiated pride and happiness, the woman Scott had fallen for in law school finally fully present after years of being dimmed. How does it feel to see your story come to life? A reporter asked. Vindicating, Scott answered honestly. But more than that, it feels like proof that choosing authenticity over approval was the right decision. The film was well received. Not a blockbuster, but critically acclaimed and successful enough that Meridian Studios immediately greenlit the sequel. Scott's second book was released to strong sales, his third already in development. He'd become the thing Doris had mocked, a successful novelist, through the very dedication and passion she'd dismissed as childish delusion. One evening, 3 years after the birthday party that changed everything, a letter arrived addressed to Marguerite. The handwriting was Doris's, shaky, older than Marguerite remembered. Should I open it? She asked Scott. That's your decision. Marguerite broke the seal, scanning the contents. Her expression shifted, surprise, then something complicated. She's sick. Lung cancer, stage 4. She's asking. Marguerite's voice cracked. She's asking if we'd be willing to visit. Scott felt conflicting emotions war in his chest. Sympathy for someone facing mortality. Anger at years of manipulation. Wariness that this might be another power play. What do you want to do? I don't know. Marguerite set the letter down. Part of me wants to refuse. Let her face this alone the way she made us feel alone for so long. But she's your mother, and you're a better person than she is. I don't want to regret not trying one last time. Marguerite met his eyes. Even if nothing changes, even if she can't actually apologize or acknowledge what she did, I think I need to see her. For my own closure, not hers. They went together, Scott, Marguerite, and Owen. The Burnett estate looked diminished somehow, the gardens less manicured, the house less imposing. Doris herself had aged dramatically, illness and isolation taking their toll. She sat in a wheelchair in the sunroom, wrapped in blankets despite the warm day. You came, she said, and her voice held genuine surprise. We did. Marguerite sat across from her mother, maintaining physical and emotional distance. Your letter said you wanted to see us. I wanted. Doris's hands trembled, and Scott couldn't tell if it was from illness or emotion. I wanted to see Owen. To see what he's become. Owen stepped forward, no longer the devastated 12-year-old from the birthday party. I'm here, Grandma. Doris studied him. The confident posture, the published author pin on his jacket, the clear eyes that held no fear or need for her approval. You've done well. You're writing. I've read the published story. Thank you. It was quite critical of its grandmother character. It was honest about toxic family dynamics. Owen's voice was level, kind but unflinching. If you saw yourself in it, maybe that's something to think about. For a long moment, Doris was silent. Then, barely audible, I'm sorry. Marguerite leaned forward. For what, specifically? For. Doris's face crumpled. For all of it. For making love conditional. For using money as control. For humiliating Owen at his party. For stealing years from you by making you afraid of losing my approval. Tears tracked down her weathered cheeks. For being the kind of person my husband would have been ashamed of. For betraying his wishes about the college fund. For driving away everyone who might have genuinely cared about me. The apology hung in the air, raw and painful. Scott searched for signs of manipulation, of strategic emotion designed to regain control. But all he saw was a dying woman facing the consequences of her choices with nothing left to lose. I don't expect forgiveness, Doris continued. I just wanted you to know that I understand what I did. That I'm sorry for the damage I caused. That you were right to protect yourselves and Owen from me. Marguerite was crying now, years of hurt and anger and damaged love pouring out. You could have had all of us. We wanted to love you. You just wouldn't let us do it without strings. I know. Doris reached out a trembling hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Marguerite took it. I was so afraid of being irrelevant, of losing control, that I destroyed the very relationships that could have given me what I actually needed. I'm sorry, sweetheart. I'm so deeply sorry. They stayed for an hour, talking with more honesty than they'd shared in 20 years. Doris asked about Owen's writing, about Scott's books, about Marguerite's graduate work. She listened without judgment, without trying to redirect or control. It wasn't redemption, too much damage had been done for that, but it was acknowledgement. As they prepared to leave, Chester arrived, looking as surprised to see them as they were to see him. I've been visiting, he explained. Trying to, I don't know, figure out if there's anything worth salvaging. We were just doing the same thing, Scott said. Did you find anything? Scott looked back at Doris, diminished and genuine in her remorse. Maybe. Time will tell. They drove home in contemplative silence. Finally, Owen spoke from the back seat. Does forgiveness mean forgetting what happened? No, Marguerite said firmly. It means accepting that it happened, choosing not to let it poison your future, and moving forward with boundaries intact. Your grandmother apologized. That matters. But it doesn't erase the past or require us to pretend everything's fine. So what do? We visit occasionally if we want to, Scott said. We let her be part of our lives in whatever capacity feels safe and healthy. We don't owe her unlimited access or blind trust. But we can offer compassion to someone facing their mortality with regret. Owen considered this. I think I'd like to visit sometimes. Maybe read her some of my news stories. Not because I need her approval, but because, I don't know, because maybe it's never too late for people to change, even a little. That's very mature of you, Marguerite said, pride evident in her voice. I learned from Dad. Owen met Scott's eyes in the rearview mirror. He waited years for the right moment to show everyone who he really was. He didn't give up or stop believing in himself even when everyone doubted him. That takes real strength. Scott's throat tightened with emotion. This, his son's confidence, his wife's healing, his family's freedom from toxic control, this was the real success. The books, the movie, the money were wonderful, but they were secondary to the family they'd rebuilt from the ashes of manipulation. For months later, Doris passed away. The service was small, family and a few remaining friends. In her will, she divided her estate equally between Chester and Owen, with a letter to each grandson. Owen's read, I can't undo the damage I caused, but I can try to make different choices with what time remained. You never needed my money to succeed. You and your parents proved that thoroughly. But accept this not as control or obligation, but as an acknowledgement that your grandfather would have been proud of the man you're becoming. Write stories that matter. Live authentically. Don't make my mistakes. Chester received a similar letter, along with encouragement to pursue environmental science, with the passion I should have celebrated instead of redirected. The reading of the will brought one final surprise. Doris had established a charitable foundation with the remainder of her estate, focused on helping families escape financial abuse and manipulation. She'd named Marguerite as its director. She actually changed, Marguerite said, staring at the legal documents in disbelief. In the end, she actually tried to make amends. She did, Scott agreed. It doesn't erase the past, but it's something. That evening, Scott sat in his office, looking at the shelf that now held 5 published novels, the framed Meridian Studios contract, and a photo from Owen's birthday party. Not the disastrous 12th, but the quiet 13th they'd celebrated as a family, just the 3 of them in Chester, eating pizza and laughing without the weight of expectations or conditional love. His phone buzzed with an email from his agent. Another studio wanted to option his latest book. A university wanted him to teach a creative writing seminar. A magazine requested an essay about choosing passion over paycheck. Scott smiled and opened a new document, beginning to type. This story, his story, their story, deserved to be told properly. Not as revenge or vindication, but as testimony that freedom was worth fighting for, that authenticity trumped approval, and that sometimes the greatest success was simply refusing to let others define your worth. Owen appeared in the doorway. Working on something new? Yeah. Want to read it when I'm done? Always. Owen settled into the reading chair Scott kept in the corner. Dad, thanks. For everything. For showing me that it's okay to chase dreams, even when people say you're crazy. For proving that success isn't just about money. For teaching me that the people who matter will love you without conditions. You're welcome, kid. But you did the hard part. You believed in yourself even when it would have been easier not to. As night fell, Scott wrote and Owen read. And somewhere in a modest suburban house, a family that had fought for their freedom settled into the comfortable rhythm of lives lived authentically. The Burnett estate stood empty, eventually sold, the monument to control and manipulation becoming just another property listing. But in that home office, surrounded by books and dreams realized, Scott Cook understood something fundamental. Victory wasn't in the revenge or the money or even the vindication, though those had their place. Victory was in the freedom to be himself, to raise his son with love instead of conditions, to build a life that didn't require anyone's approval but their own. And that, in the end, was worth more than any college fund could ever buy. This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your time. If you enjoy this story, please subscribe to this channel. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.